The reason the vast majority of the population has no understanding of shadow work, the unconscious, any esoteric subjects, is that they're not using their right brain. In Western culture, this is something that Ian McGilchrist has talked about a lot, there's an overemphasis and even a pressure, in my opinion, to use the left brain for everything and to completely forget about the right brain and to consider it nonsensical. When we do this, we become materialists, is essentially what happens. We become people who cannot perceive pattern. I call it pattern blindness. We can only see concrete matter. We don't believe anything else exists. And so we see ourselves as these sort of, because we're only using one half of the brain, we only see that half of ourselves. So we kind of see ourselves as these like animals who just kind of like spawned onto the planet accidentally, and we're just gonna die, and none of it means anything, and anyone who thinks otherwise is just stupid. They're bad at logic, right? Anyone who believes in anything aside from, what's concrete, what's sitting right here in front of me, they're just delusional, right? This is what happens when we spend too little time on right-brained subjects. And this pertains to shadow work, because when we're doing shadow work, when we're really doing it, we're engaging with the feminine, yin, right? Which we can kind of loosely correspond to right brain. It's sort of messy and sloppy and creative and non-linear and non-logical, right? It's a totally other world. When we're doing shadow work, what a lot of people might not realize is that we're training ourselves to perceive reality through right-brained, non-linear modes, through this more creative, murky, roundabout, cyclical, it's actually cyclical rather than linear, reality. That's what we're perceiving, right? That's what we're training ourselves to perceive, because culturally we've been trained so long to dismiss anything in that realm. It's even ridiculed, especially historically. It's nonsense, it's ridiculed, don't talk about it, shut up about it. And I was listening to a podcast recently, and the guy said, anything that anyone tells you not to look into, definitely look into it. So what are we really doing here? How do we even begin to train ourselves to perceive patterns and underlying meaning? That's really what we're doing when we're talking about shadow work and the right brain and all this stuff. We're talking about underlying meaning that is just seen intuitively. It's perceived intuitively. There doesn't need to be logic involved at all. Logic a lot of times is something people need and they cling to really hard when they don't know how to operate intuitively. So when you have no intuition, you're really kind of vulnerable and you need logic a lot more. So how do we begin doing shadow work, deeper layers of shadow work? By beginning to be able to perceive these meanings, these underlying patterns that are woven through your life and the reasons why they're happening, so that if it's something negative, you know how to change it. So this is a lot like, this is why people try to take logical steps to change their lives. It doesn't work at all, and they wonder why. Because a lot of the reasons why things are happening, it's sort of like a mirror, right? Things are happening inside of you, and then you're seeing them on the outside of you. So you can't change the outside of you because it's just a reflection of what's going on inside of you, right? This is not like a new concept. So it's the internal change process that changes your perception of the outside world. It doesn't even necessarily change the outside world. Maybe it doesn't even have to, but the perception will definitely change, and maybe the outside world will change pretty dramatically too. In order to do really, really deep shadow work and get really major results from it, you have to open yourself to things that most people would ridicule. You have to open yourself to esoteric practices, such as, so when we do something such as an invocation, what is an invocation? An invocation, technically, the definition is a request for help. You're like reaching out to whatever in the world you're reaching out to, and you're saying, help me, guide me through this. I need this, that, and the other, and I'm not getting it, so I need some outside help. The way I like to think of this is actually, and the way I've experienced it, is actually that when you do an invocation, perhaps like a ritual practice where you are requesting something specific, all you're really doing is opening up a dialogue between you and your unconscious. So you can, if you like, you can think of it as, oh, there's a God that's helping me get this thing. That's fine. But you can also think of it as doing these practices are simply me starting a conversation with my unconscious. So you're making a request. You're saying, I want this thing. I don't have it in my life, but I'd like to have it. Don't know how to get it. Every time I try, it doesn't work, etc., etc. So when you put in that request, what you're actually doing is saying, why isn't it here? And you're actually opening up, you're starting a dialogue with the unconscious. So then, as you do more of these sorts of practices, the unconscious will automatically respond. This is this is why it's so funny when people talk about how absurd it is to believe in more esoteric things, or that the unconscious isn't a thing, it's not real, it's like speculative, we don't even know if that exists. It's hilarious because as soon as you start doing the work, you will immediately get all the evidence you need, you will get all of the you will get a response immediately from the unconscious. So there's no amount of wishful thinking or like superstition required. It's an incredibly exact process. And generally, if someone is actually open, the unconscious needs very little invitation to step in and start throwing information at you. Now, here's where we lose most people. So, again, going back to this right brain, left brain thing, you have to be able to perceive the information that's being thrown at you by the unconscious. So, right, you put out, let's say you're doing some like ritual work, you're doing, you put out this invocation, this request for help, and you're saying, I want this to happen. I want to be this. I want to have this. And then you're like, where's the response, right? This is sort of like what the law of attraction people teach, but they, for some reason, don't teach you anything about it, really. They just tell you that if you wish for things, the universe gives them to you like a mom and dad. It doesn't. It won't. Unless you're actually capable of receiving it. So what will actually happen is you start getting information thrown at you from the unconscious. Or you'll get the thing right away. If you don't get the thing right away that you're wanting, then you will start to perceive why you don't have it. So here's where we lose most people. So we see this a lot in the spiritual world. A lot of people trying to read into messages from the universe and read into situations in their life, and they're misreading those situations, and they're doing it sort of superstitiously, and because they haven't like honed that skill of interpretation, right? So, and a lot of times the ego will just be running the show. So you're going to interpret, like a lot of these people will interpret whatever they kind of want to see, whatever they kind of like, you know, something will happen to them and they'll say, oh, it's a response to my request, and it means that I'm doing a great job and everything's working fine and I'm going to get what I want in 3 days, right? And it's like, a lot of times there's this misinterpretation because the ego is just interpreting everything. There's not actually sight. There's not actually seeing and perceiving what the messages actually are. And to perceive what the messages actually are requires two things. One, the ego has to get out of there. The ego has to get so far out of the way because it doesn't know shit about this. And a lot of times, again, remember I said, when you make a request, you say, I want something in my life. If you don't have it, and then you still don't get it after making the request, you're going to have opportunities to see why you don't have it. So here are all the things, and this is where it gets very confusing. This is where the ego has to get out of the way, because the ego is going to be extremely humbled and pissed off about what these messages actually are. So the unconscious will start to give you all this confusing shit, whether it be through dreams, whether it be through weird things happening in your life synchronistically, right? Whether it be just weird feelings coming up, bumping into weird people who are like being a certain way. Basically anything that's being thrown in your face, like really obviously and repeatedly. These are the messages. This is the information. It's your job to learn how to interpret that information and go, okay, if I put my ego all the way over here on a shelf for a few minutes, what would this situation mean? I put in this request, I wanted this thing, instead of getting the thing, I got this other shit instead. It could be like even the opposite. You get like the opposite of what you want. And this is where people go into like, it's bullshit, it doesn't work, it's not real. Or if they're not like more logical minded, they go into the superstition, right? Like, oh, it means this and it means that and it means like it's other people's fault. And so people who are have really honed this skill of interpreting the information that's coming up from the unconscious. It's not linear, it's not logical. You're having dreams that like snakes are coming to get you and you're like riding a horse or something. It's like not obvious. It's not a direct in dreams, it's not a direct, it's not going to ever give you direct information because we're dealing with the right brain. We're dealing with the unconscious, which speaks in, analogy, metaphor, symbol. That's the language it speaks. So you're pretty much almost never going to get anything that's outside of that language. That's the language it speaks. It's like trying to communicate with someone who's Spanish and they don't speak English. They're never going to speak English. You're going to have to learn the language and try to become a translator or an interpreter, right? So that's what is going on when we're talking about the unconscious. The question of whether you can use shadow work practically or not, and whether you get good at it or not, is basically, are you willing and able to keep that conversation going? So like I said, with like you put out at this invocation, you make a request, You you say, this is what I would like to happen. That's the beginning of the conversation. There will be a response, and then you respond through your behavior, through the emotional work that you do, whatever response is required to continue that conversation. And the unconscious will continue the conversation forever. It will never, ever, ever stop feeding you information, giving you insight, giving you symbols, making synchronicity occur so that you can see it. It'll give you a million chances. If you don't get something the first time, you'll get more chances. To infinity. That's how it works. But your job is to be able to keep the conversation going, and you're gonna have to be creative with that, because it's going to be a very individualized process. Nobody can tell you what your response needs to be, what your next action needs to be, what emotions you need to work through, what beliefs you need to see exist and maybe work toward changing. Like, no one is gonna, it's a very individualized process. We are conditioned to ignore and avoid and even dismiss and hate everything I'm talking about here. So the left brain has to get out of the way. It doesn't know what the hell's going on. The ego needs to get out of the way. It doesn't know what the hell's going on. All of this is about right brain perception, perceiving, like I said, symbols, underlying meaning to situations, looking at your life and different situations and seeing the underlying pattern, the underlying blueprint that is keeping it that way, so that you can change yourself, and then the reflection you see in the mirror changes, right? You change internal, and then the external changes automatically. That's what we're doing here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.